So I wanted to show you guys a project that I've worked on, a project of mine from a while back, where I take a building form and create a series of diagrams that illustrate its design, essentially how it moves from a starting point to an end point through a series of steps. So this will be applicable for assignment 1, for the first animation that you're doing, and specifically, well, both in terms of like how to think through the steps of the grids changing from one, within the drawing itself, like within Rhino, and setting up the frames, and then also an illustrator might help you make decisions about line weights, line types, and line color. So hopefully that becomes clear by the end of the video. This is the project itself. It's from a long time ago. Essentially, it was a design for a single-family house that's made from this faceted form that has kind of peels up on its corners and then has a big picture window here. This is the plan. So it has an entry here. You go up some steps here, small bathroom, kitchen is here, dining, and then an entryway down to some bedroom and then an office that's embedded. So it's this kind of like sneaking form living room here. The form itself, this is an elevation. Again, it kind of like peels up on its corners and has this overall triangulated form. This is the diagram. So again, I think one thing that's interesting is that these were done after the project was already designed. So it was a post-rationalization of the building form to try to help it make sense as a series of diagrams. These are the steps, which I'll zoom in on next. So this is the start. So again, if you think about the fact that the diagrams were done after the project was done, it's a process of reducing information or simplifying the building form so that it makes sense as a diagram. So here, the building is not exactly like this shape here, but this is the way that I simplified it to make sense as a diagram. So the general idea is that it's a rectangle, and then it has this portion of the rectangle which kind of loops in on itself and creates these interior pockets which become important for the program. So this is the first step. Again, it's a rectangle, internal loops. So what's important about these is which things I'm choosing to change from one slide to the next, and yeah, essentially like how do you make that decision. So with color, what I'm going to suggest is that all of you only use color when color is necessary, and you probably only want to use one color, maybe in some cases use two colors, and use color when a black line won't do. And think about line types showing a very specific thing. Hopefully that will become clear as I describe this. So the first operation here is we're taking that original starting rectangle on the bottom, and we are projecting that up to an angled plane, which is represented by this gray plane here. It's transparent, so I reduce the opacity in Illustrator so you can see the lines below it. And then this is just a zoom in of this corner here, and line weights and types are indicating specific things. So these two lines are the same color here and here because they're the same line. So pink line makes sense because this is also that pink line, it's just in a different state. The dashed line here represents movement, so I'm using a dashed line to illustrate a movement from that bottom sort of zero plane, let's call it, to this elevated plane that it's projected to. And then the thickness is indicating that this top line is the more recent version of the line. So this is the old one, it's thinner. This is the new one, it's thicker. Next, taking the points from that projected line and pulling them up. So in this case, we still have the original line on the bottom. We have the thick line that we just showed projected up to that plane. And now what I'm indicating is a sort of physical action, almost of pulling these points up or down to produce this faceting of the overall form. So to show that, I am dashing in the position of the original projected line. I'm showing that as a dash because I'm drawing the new line, which involves, or which incorporates the new position of those points. The points themselves I'm now calling attention to with a circle. So those circle there and that circle there. This one is gray because that's the old point. This one is pink because that's the new point. So I'm indicating the starting point at the bottom and then the end point at the top. And then again using a black dashed line to show the movement from the bottom point to the top point. And then the dashed of the pink indicates the old position of that original line. And then here I'm starting to connect those points of the bottom line to the top line with vertical lines that will start to fill in the building form. So here I just want to show a drawing of that finished line, and then I'm also adding in these lines here, which show the faceting. So this all is one continuous plane here that's on an angle, and then the corners are individual triangles that go up or down. So I'm adding in those facets. Next, I'm showing a kind of key idea of the plan. So the plan has these open spaces that face the outside landscape, and then there's these internal moments in the plan where there's services, so stairs, closets, kitchens, bathrooms, etc. And the way that I'm illustrating where those services go is again through the looping line, but I'm showing here that those loops can grow or shrink as necessary to produce the space for those services. So I'm starting to alter the looping and the position of those loops to show more. Notice too the thinness and the size of these. So I think that there's a tendency with beginning design students to make line weights thicker than they need to be, dashes longer than they need to be, and dots in this case bigger than they need to be. You can really go pretty light with these, and I think if you tend toward light, it's going to look a little bit more polished, refined. It'll look probably better. So pay attention to those line weights and dash sizes. So here's just a zoom in of that. So now we're showing the line at 3 feet, which is the typical place where you cut a plan. So this is floating a little bit in the overall volume or shell of the building. And then here's a final form where I'm showing one more additional feature of the building, which is these fins that kind of extend out into the landscape. So and this comes through in how the building is detailed. So there's this metal edge, which you see on the exterior of the building, and then that actually extends out into the landscape and goes under the ground. So the transition from visible metal to dashed line at the bottom is representing the change in its visibility. So you can see it here, you can't see it here, so that's dashed. So here's a detail view of that in the rendering. So you see the trim piece that extends out and kind of dies into the landscape here. Again, that's what's being represented with this part of the diagram. And here's the, again, the exterior rendering. So the other part about this house was the ground plane. So your relationship to the ground always changes. So you start at grade, which is how we refer to like the 0 point of ground, and then you go down first, and then your line of sight for a standing individual would be at the same plane as the exterior ground outside. This is something that Frank Lloyd Wright did a lot. And then as you move up through the building, you're at one point then kind of hovering above the ground. So you go above grade in this case, and then down a couple of steps, and you're still above ground, but it's less distance. And so this is how I represented that in diagrammatic form. So grade is represented by this pink line, or this pink plane with a hole in the middle, which is the outer boundary of the building. It's also translucent, so you can see through it. This is actually below ground, so you can see a little bit through it there. Color of gray, tone of gray, so the darker the gray indicates you're below grade or lower, and then as you move up the steps to a position like this, that's the highest, that's the lightest gray, and so the color of gray is indicating how low or high you are. And then there's another idea in the project is like different ways of presenting vegetation. So it shows up as a kind of vegetal wall. So it's chains and nets with like ivy growing on it. And then vegetation shows up as a graphic. So this would be like painted or wallpaper on a wall. And then here, a manicured landscape outside of a picture window. So it's a kind of horizontal layer of landscape that's still very designed, but seen through a picture window. So this is how it was represented in this diagram. So you're trying to make a static element, which is in this case the scale figure. You're keeping a constant with the size of the rectangle and the position of it. And by keeping those things constant, it's indicating that it's not saying anything about the size of the person or the size of the wall. It's mainly trying to call out the distinction between these different elements. So the ivy, the graphics, and then the landscape here. And then this is a drawing where I'm showing where that hanging green wall is around the building and its connection points above. And then this is where those other elements show up. So the landscape here, and then the graphics in these portions here. And that's it. So hopefully it helps. Again, trying to call out when to use different line types. And I would encourage you guys to only change something. Think about what the minimal amount of information you need to illustrate the point. So if you can do it with one line color, do it with one line color. If you're trying to indicate something where you need to call attention to something changes, then that's maybe where you show a different line weight, a different line type, a different line color. And if you're more controlled with the changes that you make, chances are it will be more clear. If everything's changing from you have 4 different line colors in one drawing, your viewer is going to want to know why that is and try to make sense of it. And if it's doesn't actually indicate or illustrate something important that's changing, then won't be able to understand your drawing. Your drawings have an ability to communicate without your words explaining them. They should communicate on their own. That's essentially what you want to achieve by being intentional and limited in the amount of characteristics that you change within the drawing.